At the family cabin retreat, my uncle sneered, "You're just the spare heir we never wanted around." Everyone chuckled as they unpacked. I stayed quiet, then slipped away to call the title company. By dawn, the property was relisted, and their weekend getaway turned into an eviction panic. I, 32M, stood in the gravel driveway of the old family cabin, watching my relatives pile out of their SUVs with coolers and suitcases, and tried to remember why I'd agreed to come. The mountain air was crisp, pine trees towering around the property that had been in our family for 3 generations. My grandfather built this place with his own hands back in the 60s, and every summer of my childhood had been spent here, swimming in the lake and learning to fish off the dock. My uncle was the first to notice me standing by my truck. He was my father's older brother, the golden child who'd taken over the family manufacturing business after my grandfather retired. He looked at me with that familiar expression of mild disgust, like I was something stuck to his shoe. He announced loudly enough for everyone to hear that I was just the spare heir they never wanted around. The comment hung in the air for a moment before my aunt laughed, then my cousins joined in, and soon the whole group was chuckling as they hauled their expensive luggage toward the cabin. I didn't say anything. I'd learned years ago that defending myself only made things worse with this family. Instead, I grabbed my duffel bag and headed inside, choosing the smallest bedroom at the end of the hall, the one that used to be the storage room. Through the thin walls, I could hear them already opening wine bottles and planning the weekend's activities. Someone suggested a boat rental. Someone else wanted to do the cliff jumping spot. Nobody asked if I wanted to join. The thing about being the family disappointment is that people stop seeing you as a threat. My father had been the younger brother, the one who didn't go into the family business, who instead became a teacher and married a librarian. When he died of a heart attack at 53, I was 24 and still figuring out my life. My mother passed 2 years later from cancer. The family barely showed up to either funeral. Too busy, they said. The business demanded their time. What they didn't know was that my grandfather, in his final years, had become increasingly disappointed with his golden son. The business was profitable, sure, but my uncle had turned ruthless. He'd laid off long-time employees, cut corners on safety, and worst of all, he'd stopped the charitable donations my grandfather had always prioritized. The old man never said anything publicly, but in private, during our weekly phone calls that nobody else knew about, he'd expressed his regrets. When my grandfather died 18 months ago, the will reading had been tense. My uncle expected everything. Instead, he got the business and the main family house, which seemed fair. But the cabin, this beautiful 40-acre property with lake access and the hand-built lodge, went to me. The will specified that it was mine alone, with no conditions, no shared ownership. Just mine. My uncle had been furious. He'd immediately called his lawyers, trying to contest it, arguing that I was unfit to manage such a valuable property. The lawyers found nothing to contest. My grandfather's will was airtight. So my uncle switched tactics. He began a campaign of contempt, making it clear at every family gathering that I might own the cabin, but I wasn't really family, that I didn't deserve it, that I was just lucky. For the past year and a half, I'd let them use the cabin whenever they wanted. I never charged them, never set restrictions. Part of me hoped that generosity might soften their attitude toward me. Another part of me was still that kid desperate for family approval, even from people who'd made it clear I wasn't worth their time. I lived 3 hours away in a modest apartment, working as a project manager for a construction company, making decent money, but nothing compared to their wealth. This weekend was supposed to be the big annual family retreat. 2 weeks ago, my uncle had texted me, not asking but telling me that everyone would be at the cabin. He said I could come if I wanted, but they'd understand if I was too busy. The message was clear. They didn't want me there, but they needed my permission to access the property. I'd said I'd come, mostly because I couldn't think of a good excuse not to. Now, sitting on the narrow bed in the storage room turned bedroom, listening to them laugh and drink expensive whiskey in the living room my grandfather built, something shifted inside me. The comment about being the spare heir echoed in my head. I pulled out my phone and opened my email, scrolling to a message I'd received 3 months ago from a real estate developer. They'd offered to buy the cabin property for development. The number had been substantial, life-changing money. I declined immediately because this was family land, because my grandfather had wanted me to have it, because some part of me still believed family meant something. I opened a new email and typed a response to the developer, asking if their offer still stood. The reply came within 20 minutes. Yes, they were still very interested. Could we talk tomorrow? I told them I'd call first thing in the morning. Then I started researching. I looked up property management companies that handled vacation rentals in the area. I checked listings for similar properties. I read through my grandfather's will again, confirming what I already knew. The property was mine to do with as I pleased. No restrictions. No family approval needed. Dinner that evening was awkward. They'd ordered pizza, not bothering to cook, and ate in the main room while watching a basketball game on the large TV my uncle had installed last year without asking me. Someone made a comment about how I should upgrade the Wi-Fi. Someone else suggested I should put in a hot tub. They talked about improvements and changes as if the place belonged to them, as if I was just the caretaker of their vacation home. My uncle asked me, in that condescending tone he always used, how my little job was going. He emphasized the word little. I told him it was fine, that I'd recently been promoted to senior project manager. He nodded absently, already looking back at the TV. My aunt mentioned that their daughter, my cousin, had just bought her third investment property. Everyone congratulated her. Nobody asked me anything else. I went to bed early, claiming I was tired from the drive. Through the walls, I heard them discussing their plans for the next day. Someone wanted to take the boat out early. Someone else wanted to hike to the waterfall. They talked about possibly extending the trip an extra day since the weather was so nice. I lay there in the darkness, thinking about my grandfather's rough, carpenter's hands, about the summers he'd spent teaching me how to maintain this place, how to respect the land and the work that went into it. At 6 in the morning, I slipped out of the cabin before anyone else was awake. I drove into the nearest town, a 20-minute trip down the mountain, and found a coffee shop with good Wi-Fi. I called the developer first. We had a long conversation about their plans, their timeline, their offer. The number they quoted was even higher than before. The market had improved. I told them I needed to think about it, but I was seriously interested. They asked if they could send someone to view the property next week. I said that would be fine. Next, I called a real estate attorney my boss had recommended once for a different matter. I explained the situation. I owned property that family members were currently using, and I wanted them removed. Was that legal? Could I simply ask them to leave? The attorney confirmed that yes. As the sole owner, I could absolutely do that. I could ask them to leave immediately, and if they refused, I could call the sheriff. He asked if I wanted to proceed with a formal eviction notice, which would create a paper trail. I said yes. The attorney worked fast. By 9 in the morning, he drafted and sent a formal notice to vacate. The email went to my uncle, my aunt, and all 4 of my adult cousins who were currently at the cabin. The letter was clear. They had until 6 p.m. that evening to remove themselves and all their belongings from the property. Failure to comply would result in law enforcement involvement. The attorney also sent me a PDF that I could print and post on the property. I drove to the local print shop and made copies. Then I stopped at the sheriff's office and explained the situation to the deputy at the desk. He was sympathetic, said they got calls like this more often than people thought. He confirmed that yes, I had every right to remove them, and if they gave me trouble, I should call immediately. He gave me his direct number. I got back to the cabin around 10:30. Everyone was awake now, making breakfast, spreading out on the deck with coffee and pastries. They barely noticed when I walked in. I went to my room and packed my duffel bag, then carried it out to my truck. My uncle saw me and asked, in that same condescending tone, if I was leaving already. Couldn't handle a weekend with the family? Everyone laughed. I told them I was leaving. Yes, and so was everyone else. The laughter stopped. Someone asked what I meant. I pulled out the printed notices and began handing them to each person. My aunt read hers and her face went white. She asked what this was supposed to be. I explained calmly that they had until 6 p.m. to vacate the property. This was my home, not theirs, and they were no longer welcome here. My uncle crumpled up the paper and threw it at me. He said I couldn't do this, that this was family property, that my grandfather would be ashamed of me. I picked up the crumpled notice and smoothed it out, then placed it on the table. I told him my grandfather left this property specifically to me, not to the family, not to him. I said that if he wanted to contest it, he was welcome to call his lawyers, but they'd already tried that and failed. One of my cousins, the one with 3 investment properties, asked if I was serious. She said they'd driven 6 hours to get here, that they'd taken time off work, that this was supposed to be a family tradition. I reminded her that when my mother died, she'd been too busy to attend the funeral. I asked her if she remembered that. She went quiet. My youngest cousin started crying, saying this wasn't fair, that they'd always come here, that this was their place too. My aunt comforted her, shooting me venomous looks. I felt a twinge of guilt, then remembered the comment about being the spare heir, remembered every dismissive interaction, every time they'd made it clear I wasn't really part of this family. My uncle tried a different approach. He said we could talk about this, work something out. Maybe they'd been too hard on me sometimes, but that was just family ribbing. He suggested we sit down and discuss a fair arrangement. Maybe I could let them use the cabin certain weeks of the year, and they'd pay a nominal fee. He was using his business negotiation voice, the one that probably worked on suppliers and contractors. I told him I'd already contacted a real estate developer who was interested in purchasing the property. His face went from conciliatory to furious in an instant. He said I couldn't sell this land, that it had been in the family for generations, that my grandfather would never have wanted it developed. I pointed out that my grandfather had given it to me, not to him, which meant my grandfather trusted my judgment on what to do with it. The next few hours were chaos. My uncle called his lawyer, who apparently confirmed that I was within my rights. My aunt called other family members, trying to rally support, but what could they do? They weren't on the property deed. My cousins packed up their things in angry silence, slamming doors and making pointed comments about betrayal and ingratitude. I spent the time sitting on the porch, watching the lake, feeling surprisingly calm. The deputy I'd spoken to earlier called to check in, and I told him things were tense, but they were packing. He said he'd do a drive-by around 5:30, just to make sure everything stayed peaceful. At 5:15, the last SUV pulled out of the driveway, loaded with luggage and coolers and wounded pride. My uncle stopped his car before leaving and rolled down the window. He said this wasn't over, that I'd regret this, that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. I told him I'd see him around, and he drove off, tires spitting gravel. The deputy showed up at 5:45, just as promised. I gave him a tour of the property to confirm everyone had left, and he checked that all the locks still worked properly. He suggested I consider changing them anyway, just to be safe. Good advice, I thought. That night, I slept in the master bedroom for the first time, the one my grandfather used to stay in. It had the best view of the lake, and in the morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the windows and the sound of loons calling across the water. I made coffee in my grandfather's old percolator and sat on the deck, wrapped in a blanket against the mountain chill. My phone buzzed with messages throughout the morning. Extended family members who'd heard what happened, some supporting my uncle, some surprisingly supportive of me. One of my father's old friends, someone I hadn't heard from in years, sent a message saying my dad would have been proud of me for standing up for myself. That made me tear up more than I expected. Update 1. The next few days were a blur of phone calls and decisions. The developer sent their representative to view the property on Tuesday. He walked the land with me, talking about their vision for a sustainable resort development that would preserve most of the forest while creating hiking trails and small luxury cabins. They wanted to keep my grandfather's original cabin as the main lodge, restoring it, but maintaining its character. Something about that felt right. But I didn't commit. Instead, I called a property management company that specialized in high-end vacation rentals. They came out on Thursday and were enthusiastic about the listing potential. The cabin could rent for premium rates, they said, especially during peak season. They could handle everything: marketing, bookings, cleaning, maintenance. I'd just collect income while they managed the work. I also called a lawyer about establishing a foundation in my grandfather's name. Something that could provide scholarships for kids whose parents couldn't afford college, or support local trade schools. The kind of thing my grandfather would have done with the money if he'd had it to spare. The lawyer said it was absolutely doable, and we could structure it so that a portion of the cabin's income supported the foundation. My uncle left me 3 voicemails, each angrier than the last. In the final one, he said he was cutting me out of everything, that I'd never be welcome at family events again, that I was dead to them. I saved the voicemail, not out of spite, but as a reminder of what I was walking away from. It wasn't much, honestly. Update 2. A month later, I made my decision. I didn't sell to the developer. Instead, I partnered with the property management company and listed the cabin as a luxury vacation rental. The bookings started coming in immediately. Turns out, A hand-built mountain cabin with 40 acres and lake access is exactly what people want to escape to. I used the first month's income to establish the foundation, officially naming it after my grandfather. The scholarship program would start with a modest offering, but it would grow. I also hired a local carpenter, someone who'd known my grandfather, to do some careful restorations on the cabin. Nothing that changed its character, just maintenance and preservation of what my grandfather had built. My uncle found out about the rental listing when one of his golf buddies showed him the photos online, apparently envious of the beautiful property. He called me, threatening to sue for some convoluted reason his lawyer had apparently discouraged him from pursuing. I let him vent, then quietly told him that 20% of the rental income was going to charity in my grandfather's name. He hung up on me. The real surprise came from my youngest cousin, the one who'd cried when I evicted them. She reached out privately, apologizing for how the family had treated me over the years. She said the weekend had been a wake-up call for her, seeing how cruel her parents and siblings could be. She asked if we could get coffee sometime. I said yes. We met the following week. She admitted she'd always felt like an outsider in the family too, never quite measuring up to her siblings' success, never quite fitting the mold her parents expected. She said watching me stand up to them had given her courage to do the same. She was thinking about moving across the country, taking a job that excited her, but that her parents disapproved of. I told her she should do it. Update 3. 6 months have passed now. The cabin has been booked almost every weekend, and the rental income exceeds what I make at my regular job. The foundation has awarded its first 3 scholarships to local kids pursuing trade certifications. One of them wants to be a carpenter, which would have made my grandfather smile. I spend most weekends at the cabin now, blocking off time for myself between rentals. I've started doing the maintenance work my grandfather taught me, finding peace in the physical labor of keeping the place running. I've repaired sections of the dock, repainted the shutters, cleared brush from the hiking trails. It feels like a conversation with him, somehow, continuing the work he started. My uncle sent me a formal letter through his attorney, offering to buy the property for slightly more than the developer had offered. I declined through my own attorney. The letter back was brief. The property was not for sale at any price. I've rebuilt some family connections, though not the ones I expected. My cousin who moved across the country visits sometimes, helping me with projects around the cabin. My father's old friends have started reaching out, sharing stories I'd never heard about his life before I was born. I'm building something new, something that feels more authentic than the family I was born into. The cabin has become exactly what my grandfather intended, a place of refuge and rebuilding, just not in the way anyone expected. Sometimes the family we need isn't the one we're given. Sometimes we have to build it ourselves, board by board, decision by decision. I'm not the spare heir anymore. I'm the only heir that matters, at least for this piece of land and the legacy it represents. And that's enough. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe button would mean the world to us.